Later after this, the White House put out a statement through Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, saying President Trump has full and complete confidence in his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, even though Mike Waltz added a journalist, a hostile journalist, to their planning for a new war.
So recently, Glenn Greenwald had a podcast where he discussed the recent leak concerning the Yemen strikes that the Trump administration ordered a few days ago, and really what it means about Trump's advisors and how they operate. I just wanted to check into that, so let's watch and let's react.
A major reason I found myself interested in and even seeing potential in the Trump movement as it has evolved over the last 8 years is that they had adopted and begun to advocate a foreign policy that they were describing as both anti-war and anti-intervention. It included critiques that the United States has involved itself in far too many wars, especially in the Middle East, including ones where our direct interest and security were not really at stake. Donald Trump prided himself on the actual fact that he did not involve the U.S. in any new wars in his first term, and said he was determined to continue that in his second term, that he wanted to be remembered by history as a peacemaker, not somebody who started wars, but as someone who ended them. Talked often about ending the war in Ukraine and Russia. He patted himself on the back quite a bit for the ceasefire deal that he engineered before he was inaugurated in Gaza. And yet, over the past 2 months since Trump has been inaugurated, we have seen a very bellicose, very militaristic, and at times war-creating foreign policy. They're definitely trying to stop the war in Ukraine and Russia. I just believe they deserve a lot of credit for that. I've given them a lot of credit for that. But at the same time, they not only stood by and gave the green light, but encouraged Israel to restart the destruction of Gaza, even though there's very, very little left in Gaza to destroy.
Glenn's right about this. A lot of Trump's support did come from the fact that non-interventionists and people that wanted less empire building and less intervention around the world generally supported him. A lot of libertarians supported him too, because you can look back at his first term and he did escalate wars in both Syria and in Yemen, but still we knew that his rhetoric, at least on Ukraine, was good. Israel, no one was counting him to change the status quo there, but this was a big part of his appeal. So the last few weeks seemed to be a betrayal of that to a lot of people that did support Trump.
In other words, they unraveled their own ceasefire deal that they themselves negotiated and facilitated by demanding that Hamas and the Gazans abandon it and release all hostages immediately instead of in accordance with the schedule set out in that ceasefire. And even the most pro-Israel voices in the U.S. and in Israel have acknowledged that Netanyahu told his right-wing cabinet members from the beginning, don't worry about this ceasefire. We're only going to do the first stage. Once we get some hostages back, we're going to resume the war and we're going to get rid of the Gazans out of Gaza entirely. And that's exactly what he set out to do and is now doing. And then, of course, you have the Trump administration's, you really could call it a new war because it stopped finally under Biden once he was on his way out during the transition, which was the bombing campaign that Biden carried out throughout all of 2024, constantly dropping weapons and bombs on the Houthis in Yemen, often doing so every day. Trump criticized Joe Biden for it, saying there's no need to drop bombs on Yemen. And yet, early this month, the Trump administration announced very proudly, very publicly, that they were not only bombing Yemen, but doing so in a very aggressive way, that they would be a not one or two time bombing campaign, but a sustained campaign. And that's now what they're doing. They're carrying out massive bombing campaigns all throughout Yemen, killing many civilians, targeting Houthis and the like. Exactly the policy that Biden carried out for the same exact reasons, with the same exact rationale. Although, as we've gone over before, and we've read you.
And by the way, Trump criticized Biden for doing that back then as a candidate.
The accounts, at least Biden had the excuse when he was doing it, when Trump was criticizing him and when Biden was doing it, that the Houthis were attacking American ships in the Red Sea and elsewhere. Once there was a ceasefire deal and Israel was no longer bombing Gaza, the Houthis stopped their attacks. They said they would, and they did. And it was only once the Israelis blockaded humanitarian aid from entering Gaza, as the agreement called for, did they say, we're going to attack Israeli ships, Israel flagged ships only, until they allow the humanitarian aid into Gaza as required by that agreement. So they weren't even attacking American ships at the time this bombing campaign was initiated.
And that's been a big lie by the mainstream media that tried to purport that these ships were attacked. You know, there's some reports that they tried to attack U.S. ships, but it doesn't seem to have ever come to fruition, the Harry S. Truman being the supposed target. But the bigger thing here, I think, that Glenn might be missing, maybe he'll cover it in a second, is we're a decade into a war on behalf of Saudi Arabia against the Houthis, against Yemen. So U.S. warships are in their territory, their Red Sea, and in their theater. So I think the American first answer is to get the hell out of there. It's not to stay in there and threaten and endanger the naval forces. The president can stop that tomorrow if he wanted. He used one of his sole vetoes in his first term to prolong the war there.
So I agreed with Trump's criticism of Biden, but at least Biden actually had an argument pertaining to the United States, whereas Trump doesn't. Earlier today, the longtime editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, which has been one of the most anti-Trump magazines in the country, it was ground zero for some of the most deranged Russiagate hysteria. It was Jeffrey Goldberg who, during the 2020 election, claimed anonymously that Trump had disparaged the soldiers who died fighting as losers and suckers. And then in this election, he was the one who kept quoting General Milley and others, claiming, and General Kelly, claiming that Trump had said he admired Hitler and was a fascist. Talking about one of the most unscrupulous operatives in D.C. over the last 20 to 25 years, as well as one of the most vociferously anti-Trump ones. He wrote an article earlier today in The Atlantic, which, by the way, is owned by the billionaire heiress Laurene Powell Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs, who inherited his billions. She became a major donor to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and she runs this magazine where he works. And here you see the headline of his article: the Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans. And here's what he writes, quote, "The world found out shortly before 2 p.m. Eastern time on March 15th that the United States was bombing Houthi targets across Yemen. I, however, knew 2 hours before the first bombs exploded that the attacks might be coming. The reason I knew this is that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had texted me the war plan at 11:44 a.m. The plan included precise information about weapons packages, targets, and timing. This is going to require some explaining. On Tuesday, March 11th, I received a connection request on Signal from a user identified as Michael Waltz, the name of the Trump National Security Advisor. I accepted the connection request, hoping that this was the actual national security advisor and that he wanted to chat about Ukraine or Iran or some other important matter. 2 days later, Thursday at 4:28 p.m., I received a notice that I was to be included in a Signal chat group. It was called the, quote, Houthi PC small group.
This is such a wild story, and Glenn's right. You know, Jeffrey Goldberg is one of the biggest left-wing hoaxsters of the last few years. So that he would be included in this chat of all people, of all mainstream journalists, really is mystifying. It really kind of defies the imagination as to how he was included. And this whole story, I thought at first when I first saw it, it must have been fake, but it was real. It looks like the National Security Administration has confirmed that it's real.
A message to the group from Michael Waltz read as followed: Team, establishing a principals group for coordination on Houthis, particularly for over the next 72 hours. My deputy, Alex Wong, is pulling together a Tiger team at deputies and agency chief of staff level, following up from the meeting in the the situation room this morning for action items, and will be sending out that later this evening. The term Principals Committee generally refers to a group of the senior-most national security officials, including the Secretaries of Defense, State, and the Treasury, as well as the Director of the CIA. It should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that I have never been invited to a White House Principals Committee meeting, and that in my many years of reporting on national security matters, I had never heard of one being convened over a commercial messaging app. The principals had apparently assembled, and all 18 individuals were listed as members of this group. I appeared on my own screen as JG. At 8:05 a.m. on Friday, March 14th, Michael Waltz texted the group, quote, "Team, you should have a statement of conclusions with taskings per the president's guidance this morning in your high side inboxes." High side in government parlance refers to classified computer and communication systems. Now, this is shocking that it's not just one of a standard classified conversation. All conversations in Washington are classified. This is as sensitive as it gets. They are talking here about a surprise attack on a country that the United States was not bombing. And they were talking about the most precise, detailed operational aspects of this bombing campaign. Where they were going to bomb, exactly what time they were going to start bombing, which military weapons they were going to use to bomb. Obviously, anybody who gets this information and leaked it could sabotage the attack or put service members who are carrying it out in obvious danger. If the Houthis know exactly where planes are coming and what targets they're going to use, they could do all sorts of things to sabotage it.
And I'm willing to bet that some of these guys in this conversation raked Hillary Clinton over the coals for using private communication for, in the pursuance of her duties, as a way to kind of eliminate a track record using government property and government servers. For this to take place on Signal is kind of wild. And for Jeffrey Goldberg to be included, it really is wild. And Glenn's right. This is just incredible. As far as a story in the news and in foreign policy, I think this is being buried compared to some other things.
To put Jeffrey Goldberg into a top secret meeting, even though he has no top secret security clearance, seemingly by mistake, but who knows? That is incompetence and a security breach of the most extreme kind you can imagine. But that's something for other people to worry about. I'm not particularly concerned with national security breaches like that. I think way too much is classified, although even I, generally on the far end of absolutism when it comes to state and government transparency, recognized, and I've always said, that of course there are some things that ought to be secret, some things that ought to be hidden. And one of those is troop movements. This would be like if you planned D-Day.
It's like really the only thing that should, be hidden from the general public. They hide all of the minutia that they shouldn't hide, but this is somehow a boondoggle debacle. It just defies the imagination.
And you accidentally included Nazi sympathizing or communist sympathizing or anti-American journalists in your planning meeting. And they learned the details in advance of the invasion of Normandy. I mean, it's on that level of breach. But I'll let others worry about that. All of Washington is aflutter about that sort of thing. They pretend to love classified information and its sanctity when it suits them, although they leak classified information all the time.
Yeah, the intelligence community sure did leak a lot of information when it came to Trump and his first term. You'd see those news articles all the time. Unnamed source in the intelligence community condemns Trump for violating national security and all this garbage. They have no problem leaking information when it suits them. Otherwise, everything has to be classified, except for this incredible error.
They perceive that suits them as well. What I'm more interested in is the debate that ensued, the conversation about the bombing attack and who said what, to get a glimpse into the mindset of Trump's national security team. So here's what Goldberg wrote, quote, "At this point, a fascinating policy discussion commenced. The account labeled JD Vance responded at 8:16, quote, team, I am out for the day doing an economic event in Michigan, but I think we are making a mistake. And in parentheses, Goldberg says Vance was indeed in Michigan that day. The Vance account goes on to state, quote, 3% of U.S. trade runs through the Suez. 40% of European trade does. There's a real risk that the public doesn't understand this or why it's necessary. The strongest reason to do so is, as POTUS said, to send a message. Now,
which is a terrible reason as it is, but props for J.D. Vance for standing against this. In fact, Vance is the last person that I would have suspected to stand against it because he's so pro-Israel and pro-bomb Iran. And, you know, a lot of the apologetics for this strike was, you know, we have to send a signal to Iran. Well, that came off to me as when George W. Bush said, I had to violate the free market to save the free market. Essentially, he said, I had to violate free market principles to save the free market. But J.D. Vance talked big about bombing Iran. So props to him if this was his actual position.
On the one hand, this is not a very vehement objection. He wasn't pounding the table and saying this is wrong and we cannot do this. But you have to remember, J.D. Vance has a potentially purely empty and symbolic role in the Trump administration. He's the vice president. He really has no official duties. Whatever duties he gets, whatever influence he has is solely because Trump gives it to him. And therefore, he's always being quite careful not to seem like he's a radical dissident to the Trump agenda. But nonetheless, he and he alone did stand up and say, I think this is a mistake because there's no real U.S. interests involved here. We have a tiny amount of shipping that goes through the Suez. It's the Europeans who have enormous amounts, and why we're out there demanding that Europe take responsibility for its own defense and that we not bear the brunt of it anymore. Here we are about to do exactly that in a way that the public won't understand. Now, I guess you might consider it a coincidence, I don't, that the position of the Houthis under Trump has been not that we're going to attack American ships, but that we're only going to attack Israeli ships. To me, this is much more a bombing campaign designed to protect Israel than to protect the Europeans. No one's going to say that. No one's going to admit that. But that's the truth.
That is the truth. And Glenn's totally right about how, you know, the right-wing Republican pro-Trump line was, why are we funding the security of Europe and the shipping of Europe in this case? Why don't we hand that over to them like Ukraine should be handed over to them? Sort out the peace in Europe by Europeans. Let the Europeans steer NATO for once. This was more or less the Trumpian MAGA kind of creed. And it's being totally violated by these strikes, this escalation in Yemen. And as Glenn said, it is for Israel, clearly.
And yet it was J.D. Vance, despite the extremely insignificant, almost trivial connection to U.S. interests, who stood up and said, this is wrong, this is a mistake. The Vance account then goes on to make a noteworthy statement, considering that the vice president has not deviated publicly from Trump's position on virtually any issue. Quote, I am not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. There's a further risk that we see a moderate to severe spike in oil prices. I am willing to support the consensus of the team and keep these concerns to myself, but there is a strong argument for delaying this a month, doing the messaging work on why this matters, seeing where the economy is, etc. So he was essentially saying, this is wrong, I'm against it, but at least let's wait a month so we can figure out what we're really doing here. Like, why the urgency? Why the immediacy? At 8:27, a message arrived from the Pete Hegseth account. Quote, VP, I understand your concerns and fully support your raising with POTUS. Important considerations, most of which are tough to know how they play out. The economy, the Ukraine piece, Gaza, etc. I think messaging is what's going to be tough. I think messaging is going to be tough no matter what. Nobody knows who the Houthis are, which is why we would need to stay focused on, one, Biden failed, and two, Iran funded. In other words, they have no way to explain to the American people why bombing the Houthis is in their interest, why bombing Yemen is in their interest. So Hegseth is saying, let's just simplify it and just avoid the real reasons and just say Biden failed, even though Biden actually bombed Yemen continuously throughout 2024. But this is always the Republican narrative. The Democrats are weak. They say Democrats and Biden were weak on Israel, even though the United States under Biden paid for Israel's entire war, funded and armed that war, diplomatically protected Israel every day at the UN.
Gave $20 billion additional dollars in 2024, I believe, in addition to the $4 billion that already is given to Israel every single year on the back of American taxpayers. Absolutely. Hegseth wanted to kind of obscure this in propaganda clearly here, and man, there's some decent things about Hegseth. He supports Defend the Guard legislation, which is absolutely awesome, but this is, truly propagandistic, and people truly show their real stripes when they're behind closed doors and talking amongst peers, not what they give the public, because we know that that isn't always correct.
It was Obama who signed a deal on his way out of office with Netanyahu to give the Israelis $38 billion in military aid over 10 years. But of course, the Fox News Republican narrative always has to be, the Democrats hate Israel, etc. Chuck Schumer, the highest ranking Democrat, has a book out warning of the anti-Semitism crisis that has engulfed America and said, my job is to make sure the left stays pro-Israel.
Yeah, the dumbest thing in Washington is one-upsmanship on Israel, because everyone knows the entire Washington establishment is Israel first. It's a bipartisan affair. It isn't confined to one or the other political party. They both try to one-up each other on it, and it's pretty putrid if your creed is America first, because it isn't.
The idea that the Democrats are weak on Israel or the Middle East or whatever is laughable. It's a joke. But Hegseth is saying that's how we have to sell it to the public. Biden failed, and let's scare them over the connection to Iran. The Hegseth message goes on to state, quote, waiting a few weeks or a month does not fundamentally change the calculus. Two immediate risks on waiting. One, this leaks, and we all looked indecisive. Two, Israel takes an action first, or a Gaza ceasefire falls apart, and we don't get to start this on our own terms. We can manage both. We are prepared to execute, and if I had final go or no-go vote, I believe we should. This is not about the Houthis. I see it as about two things. One, restoring freedom of navigation, a core national interest, and two, reestablish deterrence, which Biden cratered. But we can easily pause, and if I do so, I will do all we can to enforce 100% OPSEC, operational security. I welcome other thoughts. Very ironic that Pete Hegseth is promising 100% OPSEC, operational security, on this plan when they're all doing this planning in front of an anti-Trump journalist that they have no idea has been invited by the National Security Advisor into this group, unwittingly or otherwise. Goldberg goes on, quote, it was the next morning, Saturday, March 15th, when the story became truly bizarre. At 11:44 a.m., the account labeled Pete Hegseth posted in Signal a, quote, team update. I will not quote from this update or from certain other subsequent texts. The information contained in them, if they had been read by an adversary of the United States, could conceivably have been used to harm American military and intelligence personnel, particularly in the broader Middle East Central Command's area of responsibility. What I will say, in order to illustrate the shocking recklessness of the Signal conversation, is that the Hegseth Post contained operational details of forthcoming strikes on Yemen, including information about targets, weapons the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing. The only person to reply to the update from Hegseth was the person identified as the vice president. Quote, I will say a prayer for victory, Vance wrote. Two other users subsequently added prayer emojis. According to the lengthy Hegseth text, the first detonations in Yemen would be felt 2 hours hence at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time. So I waited in my car in a parking lot of a supermarket. If this signal chat was real, I reasoned, Houthi targets would soon be bombed. At about 1:55, I checked X and searched Yemen. Explosions were then being heard across Sana'a, the capital city, which is how he knew that that chat was authentic. Now with this story, everyone's being asked about it. Absolutely nobody is denying that the chat is authentic. When the State Department spokesperson was asked why this happened, she simply said, we're not commenting on it. At Donald Trump's press appearance, which to his credit, he does essentially every day, in the Roosevelt Room, a reporter, in a very weird, timid way, asked Trump about this story, and Trump denied all knowledge of it. Here's what he said.
You're your reaction to the story in The Atlantic that said that some of your top cabinet officials and aides had been discussing very sensitive material through Signal and included an Atlantic reporter for that? What is your response to that?
I don't know anything about it. I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I think it's not much of a magazine, but I know nothing about it. You're saying that they had what?
They were using Signal to coordinate on sensitive materials and
Having to do with what? Having to do with what? What were they talking about?
with the Houthis.
The Houthis? You mean the attack on the Houthis? Well, it couldn't have been very effective because the attack was very effective. I can tell you that. I don't know anything about it. You're telling me about it for the first time.
So this is, I'm sorry to laugh. It's almost comical. Trump's an expert at spinning this in his favor to be humorous and also drag the Atlantic. But, you know, it's probably true that he knew about it. It'd be hard for him not to know about it. He's surrounded by people that, you know, follow these stories. But, you know, he definitely spun the response to that pretty well. It is a pretty, you know, egg on the face type of situation. And Trump's the kind of guy that's not going to take that, you know, easily.
The Atlantic article came out, and obviously everybody in Washington and political circles was talking about it. I don't doubt actually that Trump hasn't heard about it. Sometimes he doesn't follow the news cycle all that closely. But later after this, the White House put out a statement through Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, saying President Trump has full and complete confidence in his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, even though Mike Waltz added a hostile journalist, to their planning for a new war.
It's just so absurd. You couldn't make this up. This would be, you know, a movie that no one would believe. And Mike Waltz is one of the worst in terms of being kind of a neocon, war first, you know, warmonger. So it really is, it looks terrible for him. And Jeffrey Goldberg, I have to say, as far as his journalistic integrity, for whatever exists of it, handled this pretty decently considering he's such a foe of Trump. Obviously he had ulterior motives. He was going to make these people look foolish no matter what in his article, but not divulging all the details of what Hegseth said almost is semi-respectable. And, you know, again, he's a total left-wing hoaxster that is dishonest as hell. But how he handled this, you know, so far from what I've seen in this article is actually somewhat respectable, which that surprises me a little bit.
And that's illegal, by the way, to transmit classified information to someone not authorized to receive it. Pam Bondi, Tulsi Gabbard, others in the Trump administration have said they will have zero tolerance for leaks of classified information. They're lucky that Jeffrey Goldberg has a very similar foreign policy to people like Mike Waltz.
Exactly.
He's obviously in favor of the bombing of Yemen because it helps Israel, whose foreign military he joined and served as a prison guard in an Israeli detention camp for Palestinians. And he's been an advocate of the Iraq War, did more than anybody to spread the lie that Saddam Hussein was involved in al-Qaeda in order to justify that war. So obviously it was safe in that sense because Jeffrey Goldberg was going to be a supporter of it. He has a very similar worldview to Mike Waltz. Both of them are standard GOP militarists and neocons. But still, it's a gigantic mistake at best, a huge national security breach. And had it been done with the wrong person, it could easily have put the lives of American troops in harm's way. And why were they using Signal? The government pays for extremely sophisticated classified networks to talk about these sorts of things on. And I consider Signal relatively safe of the commercial apps. It's probably the safest. It's the one I use when I'm having conversations that I don't want to be easily invaded, but it's far from invulnerable.
So yeah, Mike Waltz is a true imbecile. He comes out of this thing looking worse than anyone else. By the way, Glenn was kind of charitable to him, actually. Mike Waltz was an ardent supporter of Ukraine aid as well. He is a neocon. Hegseth has a lot of the neocon impulses clearly still in him. Hegseth was a big-time cheerleader for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, a lot of people have said he kind of, you know, turned a page in recent years over that, but he doesn't come out looking very good about this thing. He talked more about how to sell this to the public than the actual operational stuff and why he thought it was necessary in that first message that Glenn wrote. What a bizarre story. Really shows some true incompetence to let Jeffrey Goldberg, of all people, into this chat. But what do you guys think? Is this true egg on the face of the Trump administration and a real scandal? Let me know in the comments below. And please like this video, subscribe to the channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Take care, guys. Peace out.